Ice by Anna Kavan, a somewhat difficult to categorize book. So it is December, the chillier time of the year, and I thought that this book might be rather apropos of the season. Now, Anna Kavan was a British writer who was born in the early 1900s, I believe. I think she died in the 1960s. She had kind of a tumultuous life, had some bad marriages as well as an extended addiction to heroin. But this is her most famous work, even though her name has kind of fallen by the wayside literarily over the years. But like I said, this is a pretty difficult to easily categorize book. It's a pretty unique work. I think you might could call this like postmodern sci-fi with some flourishes of surrealism thrown in. So, what is the story of Ice? Well, my overview of the plot is going to be rather cursory, I would say, because while this book does have a plot, it's not the most conventional thing. So it's kind of difficult to summarize, sort of. Um, but I'll just kind of give a broad overview of it. So the book takes place in some kind of apocalyptic future where, due to the use of nuclear weapons, the world has been plunged into basically like a nuclear winter. Giant walls of ice, like giant glaciers, are engulfing the entire globe and are predicted to basically wipe out all life on Earth, pretty much. Um, Cities have basically been reduced to rubble because everywhere um, that the characters in this book travel to seems to be just in complete desolation. But anyway, in the midst of this, the story of the book is told in the first person by an unnamed narrator who spends his time pursuing an equally unnamed young woman who he is pretty much fixated on in a kind of possessive romantic fashion. And he is competing for her with another unnamed character. Actually, I don't think any character in this book has a name, but he is competing for the girl with another character known only as the Warden, who is some kind of high ranking political figure. Um, and all this is transpiring against the backdrop of um, war, as well as the impending icy demise of the human race. So that's the book. It is basically um, a guy um, stalking and chasing this girl, this very fragile, damaged psychologically girl across an icy, apocalyptic Earth. Now, in between that, there are inserted various instances of like surreal fantasy sequences which seemingly have nothing to do with the main story. Uh, and also, the narration segues from first person into third person omniscient, seemingly at random and then back again. So it's a very kind of involved book. It's not long by any means, but it does a lot in its slim page count. But anyway, so yeah, that is the book. Now let's talk about the technical aspects of the book. So the writing in this is pretty good. I would say that Anna Kavan was a pretty talented writer. This is the only thing that I've read of hers, but I was impressed mostly. There were a few things here and there that I perhaps might have tweaked myself or done a little differently, but by and large, she seems to have been a pretty good writer. There's a real um, kind of sense of poetry to the prose of this. It's not dull. It's shooting for artful, and I think it mostly gets there. It mostly achieves what it wants to do. It's a pretty well written book, so no real complaints with the writing. Now, as to the characters of Ice, they're not that deep. It's a first person book, and the narrator we know absolutely nothing about. All we really know is that he is dead set on finding this girl and basically absconding with her. And he's kind of a dick. In fact, the both of the men who are vying for the girl in this book are basically tools. The warden and our narrator both very very domineering and violent at times. Kind of abusive, at least emotionally, if not physically. Uh, so yeah, but that's pretty much all we know about the narrator. He is fixated on finding this girl, but then when he gets her, he kind of grows disillusioned with her, and so then he like leaves her again, only to circle back and go back for her again at the end. But that there's not a whole lot of depth to these characters. It's very focused on the psychology of the narrator and his just um, determination to find this girl, and we get like a little kind of flashbacks to him knowing her earlier in his life, but that's basically it. He has virtually no backstory. We don't know much about him, very little anyway. And yeah, and the secondary characters fare no better. There's kind of a Lolita vibe, I think, with this because the girl is kind of the victim of these two men, and she is largely deprived of representation in this book. We see her through their eyes, but she seems largely miserable. She's very delicate psychologically and physically as well. But we kind of do get the impression of a kind of um, subjection of her to the the personalities of these two men who are trying to gain her. So there's kind of I was kind of reminded of a slight Lolita kind of element to that, kind of the way that we see Lolita in that book through Humbert's eyes, and we kind of just intuit based on some kind of um, implied things about her actual psychological state. But it's kind of that vibe. But by and large, these characters do not have much depth. It's not really a character-driven thing, even though it is told in first person, which is perhaps somewhat anomalous. But yeah, by and large, the characters don't have a whole lot um, of depth or backstory. But anyway, let's talk about the story because the story is the most unique thing about this book and really what you come for, I guess, when you read this. It is, again, a very unique product. It is, I would say, postmodern science fiction with some weird, surreal fantasy sequences thrown in there for seemingly no reason. Now, you can interpret this, and I think those sections of the book are intended to kind of confuse the interpretation of the text and make you say, well, maybe this was just a dream, or maybe the whole thing's a dream. It's kind of a choose your own adventure as to how you interpret this book after you read it. Um, but it is a very uniquely cobbled together kind of thing because it blurs the lines of classification and resists pigeonholing because of that. I mean, it's. I guess this is science fiction definitely because we have an apocalyptic, a climatically apocalyptic scenario due to the use of nuclear weapons and a nuclear winter, and with giant glacial walls of ice engulfing the planet, going to presumably kill pretty much all life on the planet. So we have that, but then again, it's very kind of postmodern in its execution because then we have the sequences that it's just anybody's guess as to what they mean or what's actually happening. And it keeps you on your toes. I'll say that. You don't really know exactly what to make of this book. after you finish it. Probably, I would venture to guess that if you ask like three different people what they made of this book, you might get three different answers. And of course, the first person narration provides for kind of a psychological ambiguity, an ambiguity regarding how much of the text is actually truthful, quote unquote. I mean, none of it actually is because it's a fictitious story, but you know the what I'm talking about in terms of kind of the postmodernist um, questioning of reality and blurring the lines between things. So it's a very inventive book. I will give it that. So now, how did I respond to it? I mostly like this book. I really did. I did like it quite a bit, although I felt that the fantasy sections were kind of trying to get more miles out of this than what it could really sustain. Because if you take out the weird sections that seemingly just go off in a completely different direction and have no bearing on the main story, or like maybe they're just hallucinations, maybe they're flashbacks of some sort, you don't know. Um, but those sections of the book, I felt like it was trying to, like, if you take those out, you get something that's much more conventionally science fictional. That you take that out and you get a kind of uh, you know more mainstream science fiction story about an apocalyptic Earth with a main plot of possessive romance, kind of. But I felt like the sequences, the surreal parts of the book, were thrown in there just deliberately, just to kind of screw with the reader's interpretation of the book, and kind of puff it up a little bit more than probably what's really here. And I didn't really like those sequences. When I read those sections of the book, I was like, "What are we doing? What is the purpose of this?" Like, this is it. It just kind of I felt like it was kind of baiting you with that. So I didn't like that aspect of the book. But the actual main story, even though without all that, it is kind of more conventionally science fictional. I actually liked it. It's an end of the world kind of story with a backdrop of climate apocalypse and global war, but with a kind of intimate story about one guy, very, very, very kind of disturbingly fixated on this one girl. And he's going to find her, whether for good or ill, we don't know. But I actually liked that. I thought that's a compelling enough narrative for me anyway. So I didn't really need all the fantastical hallucinatory sequences that I don't know what to make of. So honestly, I would have preferred this book if it had been a little bit simpler than what it was. But that's just me. But my rating of Ice, I'm going to give Anna Kavan's Ice a B minus. I think that's fair. The characters, not much here really. The story is interesting, even though I think it could have been perhaps a little bit more conventionally done than what it was. But the writing's pretty good overall. So, you know, it edges it out for me. It kept me turning the pages because I was engaged with it, and I did like it. Overall, I ended up liking it. Um, More or less, or at least I liked more of it than I didn't like. So yeah, it was a positive experience. It's definitely a unique read, and I can respect it for that, even if it doesn't always suit my personal taste. So B minus. Yeah. Now, Ice by Anna Kavan. Have you read Ice? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything that I've said about it here today. And if you haven't read Ice, I might could recommend this. If you're up for something kind of wild, something that kind of resists easy classification, but something that's also like kind of fascinating in a kind of weird way. I could recommend this. I think it's a book that a lot of people will like. I think it's a book that a lot of people will like more than I did, but it's also a book that some people may just be like, what? I don't really. What is the point of all this? If you're not someone who doesn't like, if you're not someone who likes books that are very ambiguous and that don't have kind of clear cut resolutions as regards the events that transpire over the course of the plot, you might not like this. But if you're up for something a little bit more narratively adventurous than your typical sci-fi fare, I would say that this might satisfy you. I think it is a book that a lot of people will respond to well, so I might could recommend it. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.